The month of March felt like it lasted 10 years to many of us, but what was the actual emotional impact on Americans? Gallup polling surveyed Americans from March 24th to March 29th, asking them about the emotions that they experienced the previous day.
The results were pretty similar across the board, but there are key differences when you break down the data by political affiliation and also by income level. Our next guest is going to help us do exactly that. Mohamed Younis is Gallup's editor-in-chief, and he joins us now via Skype. Great to see you, Mohamed.
Great to be here.
All right, so let's start with the top line numbers of how people said that they had felt in the previous day. We've got a graphic that we can throw up on the screen here so folks can see it. Interestingly and positively, the largest number actually said that they had experienced feelings of happiness, but in a close second was stress. So it seems like it's all very complicated, right?
It is very complicated. And, the United States, these are metrics, of course, that we've been gathering here in the U.S. and actually across the world now for over 15 years. The United States tends to be one of those countries that expresses more emotions than others. I remember years ago, a couple of countries out of Asia sort of had low percentages on both positive and negative emotions. So the U.S. tends to be a little bit higher on that. Latin America actually is the region and the countries where we see very high positive and very high negative emotions. But that being said, since this COVID crisis has begun, we have seen the negative emotions rise. Stress and worry are certainly up at a national level. We are actually tracking how Americans are experiencing the COVID crisis daily through our panel, which is a little bit different than the poll that we use to report on presidential approval. So we've been really able to kind of track how things have been progressing, and both stress, worry, and boredom have all gone up. Happiness and enjoyment have, stayed steady. But it's interesting when you look by income group. In households that make $36,000 or less a year, those are the households where we see loneliness, sadness, boredom, and worry have really gone up. And it's not a surprise. At this point, over 8 in 10 Americans say that their lives have personally been impacted by the crisis. Most Americans say that they've already been financially impacted by the crisis. To put it in perspective, we've polled on Americans' experiences through every major crisis, going all the way back to the Great Depression. So through Pearl Harbor, World War II, 9/11, the Great Recession in 2008. The COVID crisis is only second to 9/11 in garnering Americans' focus so far. So when we ask people, are you closely following what's happening with COVID? In those first 2 weeks, only 9/11 garnered more focus. Now, if you think about the length of that focus, it completely eclipses 9/11. So we're really experiencing something, both here in the U.S. and globally, that is truly unprecedented.
Yeah, it really is, Mohamed. And one of the, I think, I want to pick up on something you talked about there, which is that the lowest income group in America, this really is kind of a story of class in their levels of stress. We're looking at here 62% report more stress, 64% worry, 45% sadness. But interestingly enough, the highest income group also reports similar levels of stress and worry. It matches a similar Axios poll that we had seen, in which some of the most privileged in our society are actually feeling the most jolted through what's happening, despite the fact that many in the lower income group continue to have to go to work. Does that track with this data and some of the other things that you've seen?
It does, and I think it gets right to what we were just saying, the uniqueness of this crisis. When you think about just jobs in America, whether you wait tables for a living or you're a surgeon who does elective surgery, you're shut down right now. You don't have an income. You have a payroll if you're a business owner that you need to make. People are really struggling really throughout all classes of society. It's certainly not one of a crisis that's sort of heavily impacting one group and not the other. That being said, it's also interesting that in terms of life evaluation and well-being, and this actually shows up in the happiness numbers as well, our previous research has found that at least in the United States and most developed economies, after an income of about $75,000, there isn't a huge rise in well-being assessments compared to somebody, for example, who makes $2 million. But there is sort of a middle ground where if you can pass through that middle ground, and in the United States, it's about $75,000 annually as a household, you don't see a huge rise in well-being assessments based on income. But again, that's the traditional research. We're in a crisis. When you have, based on our assessment, 60 to 40 million Americans don't really have 2 weeks of a cushion to pay bills. When you add on top of that small businesses, which unlike most European countries are really the largest employer here in the United States, it's no surprise why the economic numbers look the way they do. One of the things we'll be reporting in the next week or so is the economic confidence index number for the United States, which is something we've been gathering for decades. And that'll be really important for us as analysts to kind of see how much the economic hurt has really already set in, and across which groups in our society that's the case the most.
Mm-hmm. And how does our sort of emotional response here, and if you have any of those early indicators on economic confidence, compared to other countries around the world, in particular some of the European countries that have been really hard hit?
So we've been polling globally since 2005, 2006. One of the challenges we've had, like everyone else in this crisis, is not having a panel like we do here in the United States across much of the world. It's actually ironic. It's something that I and a couple of my colleagues at Gallup were actually working on in the UK right as things were kind of shutting down, and we got home just in time. But because we don't have a really an online way to have a representative sample of many of these countries, it's really difficult to understand how people are experiencing this crisis beyond, of course, anecdotally what we're hearing on social media. We're very much working over the next week and over the past couple of weeks, at least to start doing some polling in Europe. We've already done a poll of employees across Germany, which we've reported on both in German press and on our own news page, news.gallup.com. As well as Gallup.com, where we report on our workplace content. So we are slowly trying to rebuild our capacity to kind of get out there into the world and start tracking what's going on. We're doing a really intense job of that here in the United States. But it's needless to say, Crystal, it's been devastating for Europe, particularly Latin Europe. One of the things that's been really fascinating to some of our researchers to follow and compare are the reactions and impact on countries like Germany compared to Spain and Italy, and trying to understand, on a social level, what makes those reactions different. We already see now that the German government is planning to gradually start bringing folks back to work. I believe it was the 23rd of April was the last date they threw out there. So there's a lot to learn on a sociological level in terms of the reactions some of these countries are having. The other thing I'll point out that's been fascinating is to see what we usually call developed economies really crunching under the pressure of this crisis. One of the things I'm doing on the Gallup podcast soon is going to be featuring a conversation about access to clean water in developing countries. And as those countries begin to see their peak, it'll be even more critical to kind of figure out where their healthcare systems are going to fall short compared to, for example, the state of New York's.
Yeah, so true.
Certainly.
So well said. One last piece that you have here that's really interesting is there seems to be a partisan divide in terms of people's emotions right now. And so in general, Republicans seem to be having less stress and worry, also somewhat less sadness than Democrats and even independents. It's pretty interesting. What did you make of that?
It is fascinating, and it is sort of going back to our pre-COVID lives here. The partisan divide is really at a historic high in America, and we know that just literally going all the way back like 60 years. It's to the point where not just emotions seem to have some kind of a partisan split, but people's assessments of the economic situation have tended to have that split. So when a Democrat is in office, Democrats are more positive on the economy and vice versa. What's also interesting is people's assessment of how serious the crisis has been. Our data have not shown as dramatic a difference between Republicans and Democrats in saying, for example, the social distancing is going too far, or I'm not that concerned about contracting the disease. But there is definitely a difference. It's faded off a little bit in the past week or so. But it's another one of those fascinating things that we're watching unfold in public life in America. It is important to point out, though, that it's a lot to be made of a small group of people. So even if you go back to that slide that you put up, the difference is basically 20 points.
Right.
And when you think about the other 80% of America, and in this situation, maybe it's Republicans, and a lot of other situations, it's Democrats, we do see that 20% of people on both sides that are very ideologically driven in their responses to a lot of other questions. But again, it's only a minority of people in the country. And there's so much more, personally, my own bias, to be learned and studied beyond sort of that Republican-Democrat clash that we tend to live in the Beltway.
Yeah, something we try to delve into here on the show.
Yeah, that was something we try really hard. Thank you, Mohamed.
Yeah,
really,
you guys are
really
very guilty
interesting.
of that.
We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Always. Next on Rising, state governors have taken center stage during the fight against the pandemic, and the governor of New York is getting plenty of airtime. Friend of the show, Ryan Grimm, he talks about Governor Cuomo's efforts to slash Medicaid in the midst of the crisis when Rising continues.